Okay. Was that good? All right, I'm back. Another episode of Learning with the U.S. History Diva. I got about 25 minutes before the bell rings, so hopefully I'll be able to get everything out that you need in order to complete your assignment. So let's get into it. This week, we're covering the progressive movement. The word progressive, the root word is progress. So when you hear the word progress, your assumption is that things are changing and they're all positive. By the end of this lecture, I'll let you decide the success of this movement. But there was a lot of progress. There was a lot of good things taking place. But let's talk about the United States prior to the launch of the progressive movement. So right before the progressive movement, we were in the midst of a time period that most historians would label or classify as the Gilded Age. So I went ahead, I'm gonna just move forward a little. I want you to understand what the word gilded means. The word gilded means is to have something covered thinly with a gold leaf or gold paint. So if you cover something with gold paint, it appears to be real, but the truth is it's not. So to get you guys to kind of understand the term gilded, think of it in terms of individuals that wear fake chains. We see this all the time. Music artists wear it all the time. Students at this school wear fake chains all the time, fake designer clothes. The whole gist of wearing it is to appear wealthy, because wearing a gold chain is all about kind of like setting the tone for your status. But when it's fake or if it's gilded, what you portray is not actually real, if you get it, right? So like, stop wearing fake chains, be real. The term the Gilded Age was actually coined, meaning he came up with this whole title, this whole, saying. He goes by the name of Mark Twain. Mark Twain was an author. He actually wrote a book called The Gilded Age, and The Gilded Age was a book discussing greed and political corruption in U.S. society, which is what this entire time period is all about, okay? What prompted us to undergo so much greed and political corruption? Well, it was the Industrial Revolution. The fact that, hey, the country was progressing after the Civil War. We were making a lot of money. This was our first glimpse of seeing people become millionaires. Individuals like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, which by this time did not have the best reputation. They were considered robber barons because they were becoming successful and rich on the backs of their workers. You have a lot of movements to address political corruption and greed. Movements like populism, the labor movement, despite them not being as successful as they may have wanted to be, the fact that this was taking place signaled that our country was experiencing a lot of greed and political corruption. We also have this mass influx of immigrants from Europe and Asia coming into places like San Francisco and New York City. As a result of this massive influx of immigrants, we have nativism, which is when you have this overt favoritism to your own culture. Cities are popping and growing. And I mean, it's just a whole lot going on. And that sums up the Gilded Age. All right, so always remember that the Gilded Age is a period in history where there's a lot of greed and political corruption. Remember, guys, political machines, one infamous political boss that goes by the name of Boss Tweed, all of those stories and individuals fit under the Gilded Age period. So with this massive amount of greed and political corruption, it prompted a lot of individuals to launch another movement called the Progressive Movement. When did this movement start? It started during the early 1900s. On your test, you may see it as the early 20th century. It's the same time period. All right, what was the purpose of this movement? The purpose was to restore economic opportunities and also restore social injustices due to the effects of the Industrial Revolution. All right, so we address a lot of different areas in our country. We're addressing child labor. We're addressing equality for women. We are also addressing things that we just in total want to see change in our society, our behavior. We want to improve our cities. We want to address and help those that are living in poverty. We just want to clean up all the mess that the Industrial Revolution brought forth into our country. So how do we do that? Something that we've already discussed if you're in my class. We do that by launching, I will call, little baby movements, all right? One in particular is called the Settlement House / Social Gospel Movement. During this time, people were just like over it. The cities were dirty. Living conditions were not up to par. You had people living in tenements. You have children that's working in factories and not attending schools. And you have some social reformers like Jane Addams that decides to create what we call settlement houses. Settlement houses would be your Boys and Girls Club today. A settlement house could be the YWCA. A settlement house could be your local recreation center in your city and or town. But the whole gist of the settlement house was to provide a safe haven for those that are less fortunate. So you were able to basically go there, have services provided. It could be food, it could be assistance in finding a job. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. What I need you to know is that Jane Addams is best known for the settlement house movement, and the purpose of it was to help people in need. Why do we study this in history? We study this because these programs still exist. People like Jane Addams still exist today. And without individuals putting it in their heart and souls to say, you know what, it's my civic duty, or in this case, it's my Christian duty to help others, a lot of us wouldn't be here today. So that's why we study and we recognize social reformers like Jane Addams. Other individuals that did help improve our society goes by the name of Florence Kelly. Florence Kelly is best known for starting a campaign to end child labor. We had children as young as 8 years old working in the factory. And if all the kids are working, then who's getting an education? And if your country is not educating its youth, then how can you progress as a nation? So Florence Kelly saw the value in fighting against child labor, and she was successful in getting that done. In addition to ending child labor, Florence Kelly also helped limit working hours for women. Okay, there was a lot of discussion, studies, and articles that were being published stating that long working hours was detrimental to the health of females. All right, so Settlement House, Jane Addams. The child labor laws, Florence Kelly. All right, so women, I'm not gonna lie, like we was doing our thing. We were doing our thing because we just, I just think that, you know, women are just like natural nurturers. So, I mean, being that we are individuals that care for the children that we bear, okay, we wanted to see the world improve, and we wanted to make the world a better place. Like, who wouldn't want to do that? All right, so women also took on the initiative to also correct individuals' behavior. One particular thing that did alter individuals' behavior, and it still does it today, is alcohol. Okay, as you can see here, if alcohol is consumed too much, it can alter one's behavior. So there were efforts by a group of women to end and ban the consumption and distribution of alcohol. That launched another baby movement called the Temperance Movement. Okay, they believed, hey, people are not behaving well, and things can't change at home if everyone's drunk and turning up and fighting each other. So let's ban alcohol. How successful were they in this movement? They were very successful because Congress actually amended the Constitution by banning alcohol under the 18th Amendment. What does it mean to amend the Constitution? When you're amending the Constitution, you are changing the Constitution. You can change the Constitution by adding, deleting, modifying, but you're doing something that's going to cause the Constitution to look a little different. And they were able to do that through the 18th Amendment. Now, how successful was Prohibition? In my opinion, it wasn't as successful because people continue to consume it. All right? Something else popped up that was new, and if you ask me, this laid the foundation for a lot of the reforms that I'm going to talk about in the next few slides. So, journalism, we have to keep in mind, there's no television, there's no internet, there's no cell phones. So the only way people can communicate or get the news out there would be through newspapers. So with this large influx of immigrants, growth of new cities, and the Industrial Revolution, publishers needed to attract readers with more interesting stories. What became interesting during this time? Not blogging, not the shade room. Investigative reporting was very popular during this time in history because you had investigative reporters exposing people. And when I say exposing, I'm not talking about airdropping someone's picture. I am talking about exposing the abuses of industries as well as our government. People were tuned in. They wanted to know who was doing all the dirt, so that way reforms could be made. We call those journalists, and this will definitely be on your test, muckrakers. Why do we call them muckrakers? Because what they're basically doing is digging up the dirt. Muck, get it? They're digging up the dirt. They're exposing everybody because at this point in history, everyone is just like sick and tired. Everyone's sick and tired of having this very small elite group have all the money, and then you have a massive amount of people living in poverty. So the Muckrakers really launched this movement by writing articles and writing books exposing how abusive people in power had become during this time in history. All right, so there are a few muckrakers that you will need to know, and they're all in this PowerPoint. I'm not really sure if I'm going to post this PowerPoint because what I don't want you to do is get into the habit of not watching the video and just jumping to the PowerPoint. So I need you to pause and write down these authors that played a pivotal role during the progressive movement. All right, you have Jacob Riis, you have Ida Tarbell, you have Ray Baker, and there's more. Are you ready? Pause it. Pause it. Now, who typically appears on the EOC? Just want to point that out. Ida Tarbell. She wrote a book titled The History of the Standard Oil Company. And in this book, she uncovers John D. Rockefeller's ruthless business practices. I mean, it was ruthless. He would not pay his workers. He had them working, I mean, just ridiculous hours. Working conditions were very dangerous at the time. I mean, you didn't know if you were going to go back home. because you may die. Stuff like that. All right, here are your other muckraker journalists. You have Lincoln Steffens, you have Frank Norris, and I would say the most popular muckraker would be Upton Sinclair. He wrote a book titled The Jungle, where he discusses the harmful practices of the meatpacking industry. Now, this was major because people were purchasing meat that was not clean, and it did not, the meat companies were never required to sell it at a standard that was safe. Could you imagine purchasing meat that was not inspected by the government? Yuck. Okay? So I'm going to go back. The muckrakers that typically appear in the text would be Ida Tarbell and Upton Sinclair. But the truth is they all have one thing in common. They were using journalism to expose the abuses of industries and the government. How successful were they? They were successful because it led us to government reform. The government started responding because now they look like shit. Now, I probably shouldn't say that, but it's true, they really look like crap. Like, they look really bad, and you already know the government doesn't like bad publicity. Look at our president today. You have cities, you have states, and you have the federal government reacting to the exposure that the muckrakers were, causing, all the ruckus and the chaos and the debate and the discussions and the tea. All right, so let's talk about government reform from a city level. Just want to make it clear, a municipal is a city, all right? And cities were experiencing a lot of political corruption under organizations that are called political machines, which we've discussed, and political bosses. These organizations will often engage in an illegal activity called grafting. We've talked about this. Grafting is when you provide a service for personal gain. You're using the city, you're using your connections in the city to provide a service in exchange for personal gain. That's almost like changing grades in exchange for money from students. I'm not supposed to give out grades for personal gain. I'm supposed to give out grades based on the performance of the student, okay? So how did they at least decrease this type of corruption? They started to elect individuals that we call city managers. And just overall, anyone who works for the city now, they have to answer to someone. Okay, we're asking questions. We want to know where the money's going. We want to know exactly what you're doing. And these efforts led to less corruption, not zero corruption. Less corruption and more transparency. We become more transparent, which means we can actually identify and find out who's in charge of what, who's doing what, and if they're not doing it, let's get rid of them. All right, so that's city reform. Let's talk about state government reform. For state government reform, you need to know a particular individual that goes by the name of Robert La Follette. Hold on, wait a minute. Let me put some boom in it. Okay. Alrighty. He's right here. Robert La Follette was the governor of Wisconsin, and he's best known for being one of the first governors of any state to regulate the railroad industries. You have to understand, regulating these industries during this time in history, that took a lot of balls, because these individuals were basically running the country. All right, so he definitely set the tone for other states to regulate, and he also made an effort to break the power of political machines in local cities and towns. So, we definitely give props to him. And it looks like he was actually reading some of those articles and books that were written by muckrakers. We have some other things that came about from at a federal level. So what did the federal government do in response to muckraking journalism? Our president, Teddy Roosevelt, which we'll talk about in class, launched a bill. Well, I wouldn't say launch, but he supported the enactment of 2 laws. One is called the Meat Inspection Act. That means meat that is sold must now be inspected. It's very easy, guys. All right? And it's obvious that this law was created as a result of the book titled The Jungle, which was written by Upton Sinclair, which is why he's usually on the EOC. Ding, 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 ding. All right? We also have another law called the Pure Food and Drug Act. This requires companies to provide information on the ingredients that are in the food and drinks that we consume. So this whole idea of labeling and providing information on what we consume now became a requirement due to the Pure Food and Drug Act. Now, does this law keep ingredients or foods that are harmful to us off the shelves? No. But they're telling you that it's no good. So if you choose to consume it, that's your business. Like, it's a wrap. Okay, give me 1 second. Okay, some other reforms. Now, this list right here is major, so you may want to pause and write this down. What do all of these reforms have in common? It gave the people a voice, guys. Every single reform on this slide gave you and I a voice. What are we now able to do? Vote in private. What are we also able to do? Introduce bills. What is a bill? It's a proposal for a law. Okay? We're able to introduce bills. We're able to vote to remove bills. We're able to vote to remove someone in office. For states, it's called recall. A recall, that's almost like if something dangerous is being sold in Publix, they're going to do like a huge recall to say, hey, if you bought it, return it. You're returning something. Recall. So if we wanted to vote to remove the mayor of Miramar, that would be a recall election. Make sense? All right, so we're voting in private because it ain't nobody's business, and I said the word ain't. Don't correct me. Voters could introduce bills that has the potential to become laws. You can vote to remove a bill or a law. You can vote to remove an official. You have now direct primaries where if you're a member of a political party, you can vote for the person that you would like to have represent your party. And then you have the 17th Amendment, and as I mentioned earlier, I didn't mention that earlier, the 17th and the 19th Amendment. What's important about those amendments? The 17th Amendment allows us to vote for our senators, okay? As voters in each state, you have the opportunity to elect 2 senators to represent you in the federal government. So that was major because prior to the 17th Amendment, you weren't able to choose that person. The state legislature did it for you, and it was crazy because the state legislators were taking money in exchange for their votes. So this honestly was to eliminate bribery, which is also corruption. And then the 19th Amendment allowed women to vote. Okay, so like I said, all of these reforms gave the people a voice. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about some labor reforms. So, as I stated before, Florence Kelley, best known for having laws that ban child labor. So states are going, you know what? If we want to see progress in our country, you get it, progress, we need to educate our children. And they can't be educated if they're working. So children are no longer able to work. And if they reach a certain age where they are able to work, let's monitor how many hours they work. Even though nobody does that. All right? So banning child labor, limiting the number of hours women could work. You now have laws forcing employers to pay what we call today workers' compensation. All right, so if you're injured on the job, your employer should still continue to pay you because you've been injured on the job. Now, I think these laws were enacted because if you're an employer and your worker is getting injured because you're not providing a safe working environment, you now have to continue to pay them, right? So in essence, it's almost like you're the cause of them getting injured, okay? So if we're gonna take a break. Okay, so I took a break because it's lunchtime and it's like a lot of noise, and then I just looked at my video and like the top of my head is cut off. But anyways, back to my discussion about labor reform. So we're now starting to see states ban child labor, limit the number of hours women could work, force employers to provide workers' compensation. We're also starting to notice states regulate railroad companies. That has a lot to do with the Wisconsin mayor, Robert La Follette. And also laws that's providing safety codes for factories, which in essence promotes a safer working environment for the worker. One particular event that really prompted the need for factories to have safety codes, or let's say like emergency escape routes, or an emergency exit door, or let's say like a fire extinguisher, would be a very tragic event called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. There was a fire at this factory, and due to them not having any safety codes, the women were not able to escape the fire because they didn't know where to go. Unfortunately, 146 women died at this factory. So people were really pissed, they were outraged, and it prompted states, as well as the federal government, to support the legislation of safer working conditions. So when I look at these labor reforms, I'm like, thank God, like about time, because when we went over the labor movement, we concluded that the labor movement wasn't successful despite them forming unions and going on strike. No one really cared. So, I give a lot of credit to the Muckrakers, to journalists, them writing those stories, books, and articles, exposing the industrialists and the lack of government intervention. So what we're also starting to see is this transition away from laissez-faire, because if you know, laissez-faire means hands off. So when you think about it, all of these reforms symbolize the government's hands on. All right, let's move on. Sorry. All right, so overall, there are some people that you will need to know for your test. Susan B. Anthony, right to vote for women. Florence Kelly, the end of child labor. Jane Addams, settlement houses, helping those that are poor or in need. Robert La Follette, state government reform. He's one of the first to say, look, we got to check the railroads, okay? And then you have your journalists, your muckrakers. Ida Tarbell, who wrote the book exposing John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. I don't know why I have Jane Addams here. Made a mistake. So, Ida Tarbell, Jacob Riis, Upton Sinclair, and Frank Norris. Please remember your social reformers. Remember, reformers are individuals that want to see change. And I'm assuming that change should be better because we are talking about the progressive movement. You know, get it? Progress. So let's talk about African Americans during the progressive movements. During the progressive movement, okay? So Blacks during this time in history was like, progress where? Ain't no progress, B. I already know who's going to have something to say about that. So I'll say it again. Ain't no progress, B. There's no progress. There's absolutely no progress. As a matter of fact, African Americans were coining this time in history as nadir. Nadir means this is the worst or lowest point in an experience. So this experience of progress and reform for the majority is something that they're actually not experiencing. They're making it very clear that this movement has not benefited them at all. So let's recap what we already know about African Americans. After the Civil War, we go through a moment of history called Reconstruction. Reconstruction lasts for about 10 years, and during this time you have the enactment of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Now, when those amendments were approved, it appeared as if life would get better for the freed men, aka your former slaves. But unfortunately, after the radical Republicans lost their power in the federal government, these laws started to appear. And these laws actually set them back. It almost set them back to how they were living prior to the Civil War. What are some examples of what I would call the African American nadir experience? Some examples of that experience has a lot to do with, number one, voting restrictions. You have given me the right to vote. Well, at least at the time, you've given Black men the right to vote under the 15th Amendment. But then you turn around and you implement state laws that undermine that right. What are those laws that were undermining voting? Poll taxes and the grandfather clause. So even with the enactment of the 19th Amendment, Black women still weren't able to vote the same way Black men were not able to vote. And if you're not able to vote, then you have no voice. Nada. Zilch. Okay? In addition, we now start to see states implement what we call Jim Crow laws. What are Jim Crow laws? Jim Crow laws is a separation of races in public facilities. So we're now living in a society where you have schools separated based on race. Restaurant owners are able to separate their businesses based on race. You have public restrooms separated based on race. And the laws were legal due to the outcome of a Supreme Court case. Everyone has to know this case. This case is titled Plessy versus Ferguson. We consider it to be a landmark Supreme Court case because without this case, these laws would not have been able to survive for about 100 years. Okay? The extinction of Jim Crow laws didn't occur until the 1960s under another case called Brown versus the Board of Education. Okay? So, I mean, the progressive movement was great for everyone else except for them. I mean, life sucked. It really sucked. You're telling me that I'm free, but I can't vote. You're telling me that I'm free, but you're separating me because in your mind, you still view me as an individual that's inferior to you. Like, WTF. All right. So, by establishing Jim Crow laws, you are psychologically telling people that one race is better than another. What is that going to prompt? That's going to prompt something called racial etiquette. So, racial etiquette becomes, if you see a white man walking down the street, you better move to the side. You must address white men as sir. And white men would address black men as boy. Nah, you're not talking to me like that. So, most followed, but some was like, hell no, I'm not going to address you as sir. I'm not taking my hat off when I see you. I'm not moving so you can pass by me because in your mind you think you're better than me. Unfortunately, when we resisted those, I would say, quote unquote, unwritten rules called racial etiquette, it would often result in violence. So if African Americans didn't follow racial etiquette, they were often punished or killed. Y'all not going to talk about me. They were often punished or killed. How were they killed? I mean, there are a number of ways to kill someone. But lynching seemed to have been like a very popular way to kill blacks. And it really peaked during this time in history. You have to remember, this is not called the progressive movement for African Americans. It's called Nader. This is the worst time in history because laws, court cases have established this system where African Americans are viewed as second-class citizens. So if you're not getting the same treatment as everyone else, this is the type of life you have to live in. Okay, and it sucks. I think I said suck like 5 or 6 times. Anyways, so they were punished or killed, they were harassed, their homes and businesses were burned down, they were driven out of neighborhoods, and it led to like a mass exodus from the South, where you would have a lot of African Americans moving out west, and you also have some African Americans moving to the Northeast. But the truth is, I mean, it was more or less the same. Okay, let's move on. So, some African American social reformers you need to know for your test would go by the name of Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Ida B. Wells. Something interesting, these two, they were not feeling each other because they had a difference in opinion when it came to how to get blacks to progress in a society that has systematically excluded them. Does that make sense? So their goals were the same, but their methods were different. I repeat, their goals were the same. They wanted to see African Americans elevate in U.S. society. They just had a difference in the matter of how to get that done. So Booker T. Washington, he suggested that whites and blacks work together and that we take a gradual approach towards equality. He also recommended that we pursue technical training in order to become useful to the majority. So for example, if you become the plumber, if you become the mechanic, if you become the construction worker, you take on the positions that everyone at some point will need in their lives. And if you become needed, then at some point you will have to be respected. Okay? He was such an advocate for technical training that he founded a technical school called the Tuskegee Institute. Whites loved Booker T. Washington for obvious reasons. Okay, he recommended we take a gradual approach, meaning don't be so quick to fight. Try to work with them. I somewhat agree with him, and I'll tell you why in class. Moving on, W.D.B. Du Bois completely disagreed. He was like, we need to act, and we need to act now. We can't sit back and try to work with them because they're not working with us. Look at all of these laws. Look at how they're treating us. They're killing us by the second. Forget all that. We need to demand full social and economic equality, and the only way to get that is through a higher education. I'm not trying to work for them. I want to be right at the table with them when they're making those decisions. So in other words, we have to become politically active and involved, because you want to be the decision maker. You want to be in the room where the decisions are being made, and you can't do that if you're taking up technical training. Make sense? He's also known for co-founding the NAACP, which is still in existence today. Our third African American social reformer goes by the name of Ida B. Wells, who was also an activist and what I would consider to be the Rosa Parks of the progressive movement. In other words, Rosa Parks wasn't the first, okay? Ida was the first. Ida actually got thrown off of a train because she refused to get up for a white patron. So, Rosa Parks, though we give her props, she would be discussed and given her props in the civil rights movement. But for now, we got to show love to Ida B. Wells, who I believe is someone that is underrated and not discussed enough in U.S. history. She's also one of the founding members of the NAACP, and she completely agreed with Du Bois. She did not agree with Washington. She is best known for writing articles and advocating for the abolishment of lynching, okay? When I tell you lynching was like, it's like me leaving work and going to happy hour, and that happy hour during this time in history would be witnessing a black person getting lynched. Like, that's how normal this act of violence had become in U.S. history. Let's see, I don't know if I have anything else to talk about. I'm done. So like I said, guys, the Gilded Age really set the tone for the progressive movement because people were fed up with people being greedy and our government being politically corrupt. So we started to advocate for a lot of change. That change was great, but not for this group. All right? Please, 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 please complete the assignment, rewind, pause, do whatever it takes to get this info, and I'll see you in class. Thank you.